Here we are again with the countertop as the jig, so to speak. I am not going to build a jig for my horizontal stabilizer. This is the same idea as you've seen for the other tail pieces. That's the countertop, and I measure everything out using a reference corner. I lay down my pieces of masking tape, mark my lines, mark my dimensions, and I just build right off of the countertop like I have in the past. Nothing too exciting, just kind of a general recap here. This picture coming up is how I started the horizontal stabilizer. I used my square on the corner of the countertop, and using that square I laid down my masking tape and I drew my my reference lines and my dimensions. I have a video coming up and I'll get into all of this in more detail. These are just some still pictures I had to give you an idea of how I had done things. This next picture here is just a close-up of the masking tape with a couple of dimensions on it and the reference lines, and again this will be explained in the video. Nothing exciting. And then the next picture is just another shot of the same masking tape. So again, laying everything out on a counter, it saves you the trouble of building a jig, and as long as the countertop is big enough and flat, I think it's a very, very good way to build. So let me get on to video 1 here and I'll do some explaining. Okay, here's a brief little narration that accompanies some of the pictures that I've taken so far for the layout of the horizontal stabilizer. This is for the solid 90-inch stabilizer without obviously the elevators. So what I decided to use, since I have these flat countertops out in my shop area, I decided to build right on top of the countertop just like I did for the rudder. So what I did, this is probably going to be out of focus if I try to zoom in here too much, but what I did was I laid out some masking tape, and I using a square, like you'll see in the picture, I put a square on this edge here and then ran it up the tape and drew my line, and then I measure the edge of the countertop here is my reference. So I measure from this edge here up the line 18 inches, which is represented here, and then from this line I come over and mark this line, which is 3.5 inches, which is represented here. So that's how I did that. And then from using this corner as a reference, I come down the countertop 90 inches to my other tape here. This is 90 inches here. Using the square again off of this edge, I come up 18 inches, which is represented here, draw this line, and then I come across from here, I come over to here 3.5 inches, which is represented here. So I have my 18-inch line, 18 inches wide from here, from this edge up. This is 18 inches, and then from there over 3.5. So if you can imagine the horizontal stabilizer, this is the aftmost edge, and then from this corner it tapers inward 3.5 inches up to here at an 18-inch width. That's all that represents. So that's how I have it laid out, and from there I'll start laying in my boards using this as a reference, and then coming out this way at an angle to this 3.5 inches, and then from this point straight across to this point. That would give me my basic tapered shape, and those dimensions are taken right off of the prints. And that is where I'm at so far. So from here I'm going to start laying out my wood directly on the countertop. Anywhere there's going to be joints that need epoxy in these corners and wherever else, I just lay down a little bit of wax paper so that the epoxy doesn't stick to my nice flat countertop. So I'll get into some more of that a little bit later on, but this is where I'm at so far.
Alright, I'm going to try to explain this the best I can, and hopefully it will make a little bit of sense to you. Here on the other end of my horizontal stabilizer, I have the tape laid out on my countertop just so I have something I can draw lines on. And I've got lines drawn here with just little notations to let me know what the dimensions are that the lines represent. What I'm trying to do now is get these angles, the various angles cut on the individual pieces of wood to make up this outer edge that, according to the prints, from the outer edge here up to the front, the leading edge of the front of this horizontal stabilizer is supposed to be 18 inches. So I have a line here which represents my 18 inches. And then this line here is my 3.5 inch tilt, if you will, from the pure vertical line here. So what I need to do is I basically need to get this piece on that cross here, and then of course down at the other end it needs to be flush here, and that should be on the line as well. So this is my pure vertical line. And then you come over the 3.5 inches to this intersection here. And then you have to cut the pieces accordingly to get that angle there. Now, I've done enough of these cuts already because I did my other end way down there. That corner where the C-clamp is done, and the leading edge end is also cut. And it seems to be right around 11.5 degrees, give or take, for these different angle cuts. So this angle here is roughly 11.5 degrees, and this angle on the end of this piece, so that when you have it on here, this stays flat. That cut there is also 11.5, and then on this piece, this angle here is 11.5. That's the piece that will go here, and then this piece ties them all together this way. And again, if you look, I can't do this one-handed. My piece is on the line. Up here is my 3.5 degree mark, and when you get these all synced together, that's how they fit. Of course, none of this is laid out. This is the only piece here that's secure. These other pieces, they need to be shimmed eventually, because this piece here is going to get cut at a taper. So it starts out thin, and as it comes back it gets wider. And this piece here can't be laying flat on here. It's got to be shimmed up as well. But I'm just getting the angles cut for now. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to have to... This is my leading edge piece. This leading edge piece is going to have to be cut to the proper length, and also at that 11.5 degree angle this way to mate with these pieces. And of course these are going to have to be angle cut as well. But from what I can gather, all of those cuts, all these cuts at this end and at this top end, are roughly 11.5 degrees. So let me go ahead and cut the rest of those angles, and I'll just temporarily put this together loosely, just laying on the bench top here, and we'll see what we end up with. Coming back over to the other end, I almost forgot to mention one more thing. Again, using the tape, I've got my corner somewhat fixed here, and then over on this end, probably can't see very well because of the shadow, I got it on my crosshair for the angle, that 3.5 inch tilt, if you will, from pure vertical inward. What I did was, if you look here, this is my 18-inch line. This line represents where the front edge of the leading edge is supposed to be. And if you look on the print, this dimension, this overall dimension here is roughly 1 inch. So what I did was, from that forwardmost line that represents the front of the leading edge, I came back 1 inch and drew another line. This line represents obviously the back of this leading edge piece this way. If I can get that other end to move one-handed, I'd be surprised. Roughly like this. And since this end piece here butts up against this piece here, this line now becomes my cutoff line for this piece. So what I did was, I just went ahead and I already got these pieces cut roughly. I think, like I said, that angle I think is about 11.5 degrees. So I fit my corner together, and I get my edge on that cross reference point over here, and then that line, that 1 inch line here, is my cutoff mark for this piece, and then the leading edge will fit right in here like that. This will all come together. I can't hold it all and the camera at the same time, but that will all come together in that corner there, and then of course any excess will get trimmed. This corner needs to get curved because this is the leading edge of the whole entire horizontal stabilizer. So another couple of tidbits with some simple tape and some reference marks, and now I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of these pieces with those with that 11.5 degree angle and see how it looks. So here's the horizontal stabilizer, just about ready for epoxy. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about. First, I milled the slots for my my design hinge that I'm going to use. This is the exact same design as I'm going to use on the rudder, which I've already talked about. I did 3 slots per elevator, so there's six slots total, and that's for my hinge design. Now that I think about it, I should probably have pre-drilled these through holes so that they're straight, but I can do that after the fact on the drill press. I'm not going to take this out of here now because it took so long to get it set up correctly. So I did that. I milled the slots for the hinges. And again, that's my design hinge from the same as used on the rudder. Now I'm going to show you these pieces here as they are, but before I epoxy them, I'll pull them out and explain them a little bit. This piece here is a 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch piece, and it's epoxied to this 1/4 inch, 1 inch piece here. But this piece is tapered, so here in the corner, this is 1 inch here, same as this piece. This is 1 inch high, if you will. This is 1 inch, and then it tapers as you go across. It tapers down till you get to this end. This end is roughly 3/4 of an inch, which is the same dimension as this leading edge. And I'll show you that in a minute. But this piece is tapered, this piece is not. And in this corner here, this is 1 inch, same as this. So this rests right on the table, just as this piece does. It rests right on here. So this corner rests right on the tabletop. And then as it comes down, I've got these popsicle sticks that I use as spacers to maintain this gap all the way across. So this piece is parallel to the tabletop. This piece is tapered, this piece here. So if you could see it from this side, this edge on the bottom is not touching the table. Let me see if I can get that. So you can see the daylight there, how this corner is up in the air, and as you come back, this piece here on the bottom is actually resting on the table like that. So you can kind of see the taper here. If you imagine this piece being tapered, as you come across you get more and more daylight showing underneath. And then I've got my spacers also underneath the trailing edge piece to keep this piece square with this piece, which is square with this piece. So this piece, and this piece, they're all on the same plane, if you will, going all the way around. And then of course I did the same thing down here. I've got my spacers where needed for the taper, like that. These pieces of wax paper are just to catch any epoxy drips once I go to epoxy all these together, or in this case here, so that the wood doesn't epoxy itself to the tabletop, to my countertop. So that's what I have so far, and I'm going to epoxy all of this together. Now I'm going to pull this off. See if I can show you this a little bit here. Again, this centerpiece here is just 1/4 inch by 3/4 inch, and this is that 11.5 degree angle that I was talking about earlier. This is 11.5 degree angle, and this edge piece here is also cut at 11.5 degree angle. And then before I epoxied this piece onto this piece, I tapered it. Now I don't know if this is going to be easy to see or not, but this is 1 inch as shown on the print, and then it gradually tapers down to 3/4 of an inch here. This 3/4 of an inch matches the height of this leading edge from here down to the other side. Now once I get this all epoxied, I'll come back and I'll round off this corner, and I'll make the transition from this rounded over leading edge to the straight that comes across this way. And I'll do that after I get everything epoxied back together. So here's my taper, and then this piece of 1/2 by 3/4 is just epoxied down the center of the tapered piece. So you can hopefully see how this piece is centered on this piece. Here are my reference lines. And then on the other side, it maintains that, more reference lines, it maintains staying center. So there's more meat, if you will, here than on this end. There's a little bit here, a little bit on the other side, and down at the fat end, there's quite a bit more here and here. And then this piece, ultimately, we'll go right back like that, and then all my gussets will sit down inside of here, so that when I put the fabric on, you won't see them. The fabric will stay up on this higher edge and come across and catch the stringers that will go across here, and hopefully these gussets that will sit down in here won't be visible, or they'll be barely visible through the fabric. So that's where I'm at. I'm going to double check this, make sure that it's flat and square and set up correctly, and I'm going to go ahead and epoxy. So here's my horizontal stabilizer with the main beam here has been cut, and you'll notice that I did pre-drill the holes here for the cables that will run from here up to the vertical stabilizer. Little note, when you look at the prints, it will call out the locations for the stringers that run across from leading edge to trailing edge. I think there's eight of those pieces. But when you look at the print, it will call out the locations for those, and you want to make sure that these holes are not right where one of those stringers are going to run. I moved mine out toward the tip just a little bit to make sure that it wouldn't interfere with the stringers when I run them in this way. So I have the beam, I pre-drilled the holes on both ends for the cable fittings, and then went ahead and cut it to the length required to maintain the 4 inches. When you look at the print, I think it's 4 or 4.5 inches from the leading edge to the back edge of this piece, I believe. but that you want to maintain that dimension and cut it to length to fit. And then of course it has to be put up on spacers as well, shims, to maintain that center line the same height through the center of the wood. The center of this piece is in line with the center of this piece, which is in line with the center of this piece. So they're all on the same plane going across. You don't have them doing this, the center line. So I have that piece shimmed there and on the ends as well here, so that they're centered to the other pieces. You can kind of see here. The other thing that I did was I started cutting the cross members here, these diagonal braces, and the way that I cut my tips, like I usually do, is so that there's a bearing surface here for the two pieces to meet. Rather than come into a point, I lop off the end this way so that the other piece can fit in like that. I just have more contact surface, and I do the same thing down at this end so that the piece that I'll be putting in this diagonal across here will be the same way. It has something to push against here and here. Same here, it will press against here and here. So that's where I'm at. I have my stringer pieces here planed down nice and thin, and I've got enough material here to make my 8 that go across. So this piece is ready to go in. Here's my stock for the piece that's going to go across here, and then I'll start cutting down my stringer pieces to come across this way. That, and then gussets for all the corners, for all the joints. These will all get gussets top and bottom, or front side and back side. And then I'll be able to unclamp everything, flip the whole assembly over, and put the gussets on the other side. So once I get the main frame, if you will, clamped into place, and I go ahead and I'll use my various weights, and I'll just wedge stuff in. This is just a piece of wood wedged up against here, and my milling machine, just to keep some clamping force on this joint and the matching joint down at the other end. I just lay it all out on my bench, and I'll wedge, pieces of wood in various places, as you see here, just to maintain a clamping force. I'll use my little weights to hold everything in position and just make sure nothing shifts or rolls around or moves. And once I get that established and I start my epoxy, I leave everything in place. I don't start removing clamps. I don't start pulling out the pieces of wood or moving the weights around until the whole thing, all the components are in place and epoxied. The main beam, the cross braces, the stringers. I get as much material as I can epoxied in place while everything is clamped down and stationary and it won't move. Once all that's done and I have no choice, then I take everything off and I'll flip it over and do the gussets on the other side. So that's where I'm at now. I'm going to get these last few pieces cut and epoxied in place, and then hopefully tomorrow I'll be able to flip it over and do the other side. As you may already know, I make these videos as I go along with my construction, and since this video is on the tail sections, I started the vertical fin quite a while ago, and from there I moved to the rudder, and from the rudder I've moved to this. And that's been, I don't know, a few months anyway, and I can't remember exactly what I have talked about and what I haven't, so some of the stuff that I talk about may repeat from one component to another. So I may cover some stuff here with this horizontal stabilizer that I've covered already in the rudder construction. So my apologies for that. Moving on then, what you see here is my completed horizontal stabilizer up on these plywood blocks. What I have done are the gussets on the one side, which you can see here. There's a corner gusset on the back side. All of the backside gussets are now in, and I have flipped the horizontal. That's nice. That's the dryer buzzer. I have all the gussets on the backside done, and I have the stabilizer up on these plywood blocks, and I am getting ready to do the gussets on this top side. I have the gussets all cut and ready to go, and I don't know if I talked about this before or not. I believe I have. What I like to do with my plywood pieces is I'll either, if they're big pieces, I'll just wipe them with a soaking wet rag. If they're small like this, I'll just run them under water, and then I let them air dry, and that really raises the grain, and it allows a lot more grip, if you will, for the epoxy. So I just take these small pieces, all my gussets, and I run them under water, let them air dry, and that nice raised grain really gives the epoxy something to bite into. So I've done that, and I'm letting them air dry. When they're dry, I'll go ahead and I'll put them all on this top side. The other thing that I did, which is what I had done with the rudder, and I also need to do with the, or I'm sorry, I did it with the vertical fin. Ah, the dryer. Lovely. All right. I did it with the vertical fin, and I need to do it with the rudder. I haven't yet. Just put these little blocks in between these stringers, and the blocks just maintains that arch, the contour of these stringers, top and bottom. Because when you put the fabric on here and shrink it, it will draw these down and flatten them out, and you don't want that. You want to maintain some spacing between them. Now obviously these are attached at the front, and they attach here at this beam, which is thicker than the front, but they do not contact this beam, which is thinner than this beam. So in order to maintain this curve that's set up here across this span from here to here, I put these blocks in, and those are run all the way down on each set of these stringers. And I'll supply a couple of photographs of that process, which is incredibly easy. There's nothing to it. What I did was I just roughly found the center for this span here. Just rough guess, using my fingers, roughly center. Marked on either side of the block with a pencil, pulled the block out, put some epoxy on the block, spread these apart with my fingers, and fit the block back in where the pencil marks are. And that's it. So this is where I'm at so far. I'll get these gussets fully dried, and I'll put them in place, and then I'll move on to doing these contours for the leading edge corners.
So real quick, I just wanted to throw these pictures in here for the spacer blocks between the stringers. This simple picture here is just where I marked roughly the center between the long span on the stringers for where I will be placing my spacer block. And then the next picture here is the spacer block in place. There really isn't any set size for these. I just took a piece of scrap wood and started cutting up the little blocks and putting them in. The height, the space, if you will, between the spacers, you have to maintain that so it maintains the airfoil shape. But as far as the width or the length, depending on how you look at it, that the spacer is between there, that really doesn't matter. So just put something in there so these stringers don't collapse while you're putting on your fabric. Next up here are the photographs of the front corners of the horizontal stabilizer. Now it may appear that I cut these corners and then backfilled the cuts with some spruce and plywood to get these 45-degree angles. That is not the case. When I cut the angles, I just made sure that I didn't cut them back or cut them deep enough that it would basically separate the pieces of wood that made up the square corner. When I cut these, I just cut them back far enough to get a 45, or roughly a 45. Actually, I don't think it is 45. I think I just kind of guessed at what angle to use and then made them both the same. But there isn't any added wood in these corners, is my point. I just cut the corners and then filed and sanded them to get the shape that I wanted. If you go back to some of the other photographs and video of the horizontal stabilizer prior to these corners being cut, you'll get an idea of how much I took off. But just bear in mind, you don't want to take off so much that you have to end up coming back with some wood and filling it in. At least that's how I did it. So these are the corners, just cut by hand and then shaped by hand with files and sandpaper and whatnot to get the look you see here. So a couple pictures coming up of the finished product on the bench top, and I think that will just about wrap it up for the horizontal. Next will be the elevator. That will be the last segment, or I should say the elevators, plural. But that segment is going to be short and sweet because the method of operation, so to speak, is the same as these other components, using the workbench and tape, no jig, and they are incredibly identical to the rudder itself. So the elevator segment will be short and sweet until the point, and then I'll wrap it up at the end as usual. Alright.
Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.